when you're a journalist a long time, you cover a lot of elections and they go lots of different ways. Every recent election, it feels like new ground. This has never happened before. But I will say, I don't know that we will ever see the speed at which policy change we are seeing happen at this speed ever again. It's quite incredible, and also really important that we do our job, because sometimes when things move at this speed, you get headlines really quickly. But when you dig really deep, sometimes the stories and how they impact individual communities might be a little different.
This is Hourglass, the podcast for United Way of King County in Seattle. Coming up, we'll talk journalism and media with United Way board member Julie Wolfe, news director for Seattle's King 5 Media Group. We'll also hear from United Way board chair Steve Hooper on why he supports our organization, and we'll discuss a local volunteer opportunity. I'm your host, Joe Burris. Thanks for tuning in. In the 1988 military film Biloxi Blues, the film's lead character, Eugene Jerome, chronicles his Army experience in a diary he keeps hidden from his comrades. During one scene, Jerome is confronted by his comrades, who secretly read what he's written about them in his diary. Jerome insists that his writings are not factual, just his private thoughts. But they take everything he's written about them as if it is factual and true. Something magical happens once words are put down on paper, Eugene later muses to himself. People figure no one would go to the trouble of writing it down if it wasn't the truth. Responsibility was my new watchword. With each daily news cycle, members of the traditional and non-traditional media tap into that magic. They can be seen as credible and trustworthy, in part because they went through the trouble of publishing a report. Years ago, if you wanted authentic news, you went to a news source, a newspaper, radio station, or television. Now, practically anyone can be a news source. With a popular social media page, blog site, or podcast, you can command as much attention and credibility as CNN, the New York Times, or National Public Radio. With so many news sources having never honed their craft with formal training and seasoned erudition, with everyone clamoring for the public's ever-decreasing attention span, and with very few laws against disseminating information that is sensational, misleading, or downright false, responsibility has never been a more important watchword. And now we've entered a 2025 that has news headlines coming at us with the speed that could outrun the Millennium Falcon. We knew that the new year would usher in new governments at the state and federal level, and both changes would impact the daily news cycle. But few of us could have imagined it would be this intense this soon. How do we navigate it all to ensure we stay informed? Who do we trust to give us news and information that is factual, unbiased, and objective? United Way of King County is fortunate to have on our board of directors Julie Wolfe, news director for Seattle's King 5 Media Group. Like other members of our board, Julie brings knowledge and insight from her field that helps bolster United Way's efforts to work side by side with communities to build an equitable future for everyone. Julie has served as King 5 News Director since 2021. In 2023, King 5 News won the Annenberg Public Policy Center's Brooks Jackson Prize for fact-checking. The award honored a King 5 series on a misinformation campaign that sought to undermine trust in Washington state elections. Prior to joining King 5, Julie was news director of WHAS 11 in Louisville, Kentucky. Under her leadership, WHAS news coverage earned Emmy, Edward R. Murrow, and Associated Press awards. Julie was named to United Way's board last June, and last October she co-led a discussion on media literacy in elections as part of our Conversations for Change series. Recently, Julie sat down for a discussion with Hourglass as part of our series highlighting members of United Way's board, which comprises more than 36 people from corporate, nonprofit, education, media, and service fields. We invited Julie to discuss how she got started in the news industry, how journalism's changed over the years, how the public should navigate the ever-changing news cycle, and why she decided to join United Way's board. Here's what Julie had to say.
I think I'm one of those rare people who was almost born wanting to do what I am currently doing, which is such an incredible blessing. I know that. I've always loved reading. I was always that kid that asked why, and was nosy, and I spied on my neighbors when I was little. And it was just, I just wanted to know things. I wanted to know things that other people didn't know. And I wanted to always understand what was happening around me. And so I was thinking about writing. That was something I liked to do. But when I was a teenager, I lived in Atlanta. And at the time, the CNN Center, you might remember this, for people that are listening, the CNN Center used to have this tour. And at the end of the tour, you could pay $14.99 and get a VHS of you sitting at the anchor desk reading a teleprompter. And my grandmother at the time bought me that VHS. And I just loved it. And I kind of never looked back. And so I went to the University of Georgia. Go Dogs. Yep. For journalism school. And as is kind of the story of so many journalists, I lived in a lot of places for, kind of learning the trade and getting to bigger markets in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Fort Collins, Colorado, Buffalo, New York. And then Atlanta was home for me at the time. And I spent a lot of time in Atlanta as a reporter and what we call MSJ, a multi-skilled journalist, which means you shoot, you write, you edit. And that's where I ended up getting into management, into digital particularly. I understood that the future of our industry is digital. And so I became a social media manager and then a digital director and then assistant news director and then news director. I went to Louisville and was a news director there for a little bit. And then I've been at King 5 for almost the last 4 years and love Seattle. I really, really do. So that's kind of my journey.
So can you compare and contrast some of the stops, particularly say Atlanta, Louisville, Buffalo, and here?
Yes. I think sometimes, first of all, I will say every place I've lived has wonderful things and struggles and wonderful people and, people that you might disagree with. Every place I've lived. I think that Atlanta is a city that very few people are from that city. So getting people to care about civics is challenging. Getting people even to care about their sports teams can be challenging because, they're often bring their own kind of things they care about. Atlanta, they would say is the city too busy to hate, but people from Atlanta sometimes we said was the city too busy to care. And so that was a challenge both as I think living there and as the city grew and just become so big, and even covering news. Louisville is a much smaller city. People cared deeply about so many things. I was there during Breonna Taylor's murder and the city's response afterwards. And it was a really challenging time for the city, particularly for the Black community. I also saw a city of leaders and people learn and grow and respond in ways that I think were really interesting that might have been harder for a bigger city to do. And people in Louisville love their local news. They love their paper. They love their television stations. So very different from Atlanta. And then Seattle, I think, is a really interesting city because I think what I have found is that people are informed about their local communities, their local leaders, their local issues, and they want to know more. And as a journalist, that is a city I love because I want people who want to care about the community around them. And I really see that. I think we see it in things like the number of people who go to city council meetings and school board meetings, the people who vote and get involved. And when you talk to people on the street, they tend to be a bit more informed about, who are your leaders in your area. And so I think that is really great for us as a city. I think a city that is a strong journalism city, strong paper, strong news, strong information is just a stronger city because those are, again, you can make better choices to grow a city, to grow your community if those are informed choices. So that's kind of how I compare them. That's a great question. I haven't ever thought about it that way before.
Thanks. And I know when you talked on the Conversations for Change, you talked about the different types of news, and you said that it's kind of like a buffet.
Mm-hmm.
There's some things on there that you want and some things that you don't want. And I think I told you, I stepped away from journalism after 30 years in 2015. And I can only imagine what the buffet must be like now. What is it like to be a journalist in this climate, particularly over maybe the last 5 years, where anyone with a good social media page and a good cell phone camera can make news, can report news?
It is so challenging. I'll go back to the buffet. The buffet is more varied than it's been. There's a lot more junk, but also sometimes what you're getting isn't what you think you're getting. And that's the most dangerous thing I think about it. As a journalist, I think there are a couple of dramatic changes I have seen in the last 5 years. The safety and threats to journalists are incredibly high, and that's not just my perception. There's a lot of studies that support that. Threats to journalists, physical harm to journalists. And so we've had to teach our journalists how to de-escalate situations, how to be really aware of their situations, self-defense as far as, how to get out of situations. And so that is there. I think it's also hard to continue to do a work that you don't always feel like has an impact. And I've talked to people that were first responders in the emergency room during COVID, and they kind of felt that way sometimes. There's nothing I can do, and that is really hard. And so when you work really hard and you believe in what you do, and it starts to feel like, does this matter? Can be really hard. And so it's to lead a room full of journalists, you have to believe what you do matters, or you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't do it. It's too hard. You don't make enough money. It's too hard. So you have to believe what you do matters. So I think that's the biggest thing is really, people used to come maybe to the Baltimore Sun, you used to work for Seattle Times, and they would believe, King 5, like, this is the news and this is where I go to get my information. And now instead it kind of trickles down in different ways. Trying to fight through that noise is one of the biggest challenges we have as journalists. I want to point out, going back to something you said, if anybody with a cell phone and social media can kind of pass along information. Our newsroom, we have a principles of ethical journalism that is very strict and very high. We have really high standards of, when we do, for example, use an unnamed source, what are those standards and how do those thoroughly get through there? And if people do not follow those ethical standards, they get fired. Okay. And so and that's part of my job. And that has happened before. And that is when you get those, when you get those from traditional vetted, media sources. And so I think that's something to think about for people, particularly if they're like, I'm not sure this sounds quite right. That doesn't mean, by the way, that your community members that are publishing things are wrong. They might be right. Because, we can't have a reporter at every single place. And sometimes people go to a city council meeting or a school board meeting and they're putting out absolutely correct information. So I think just think about the source. And your neighbor might be a great source of information, by the way. But just know what you're picking off that before you eat it. And certainly before you spread it, make sure you know what you're picking out of that buffet.
And when you come out of the 2024 election, it's from a journalist standpoint, what are some takeaways that you had from it?
That is such a great question that I really want to thoughtfully respond to. First of all, I think there was the election itself that we had to cover from a factual standpoint. Understanding what it meant for different groups, what it meant for different issues and different policies, understanding that you have a diverse group of journalists that might have their personal feelings about that we all purposefully put aside to do an objective journalistic job that we are meant to do. That doesn't necessarily mean that those feelings go away for people, no matter what their leanings are, no matter what their experiences are on policies that were really front and center in that election, including, transgender care issues, including LGBTQ rights, including immigration status. including racial identity. There were a lot of things that became part of that election that, as humans, I think people had strong feelings about. And that's the hard part also, I think, about journalists, is how you separate that from covering the story. So that happened. There was, as I said in the conversation of change, there was also a lot of anxiety leading up to the election, worried about another January 6th event. And so I think that there's some relief that violence, that incident that happened on January 6th before it didn't happen. I think about what I heard former President Barack Obama say one time, that the sun will rise again tomorrow. And so when I had journalists who feel different feelings, no matter what they were, I quoted that quite often. The sun will rise and we will be here, and we have a job to do no matter who wins. We will be here covering those issues. I will say, as we talk today, so we are 3 days into the inauguration, and an incredible speed of news has happened. That is unprecedented. I will say, as you cover, when you're a journalist a long time, you cover a lot of elections and they go lots of different ways. Every recent election, it feels like new ground. This has never happened before. But I will say, I don't know that we will ever see the speed at which policy change we are seeing happen at this speed ever again. It's quite incredible, and also really important that we do our job, because sometimes when things move at this speed, you get headlines really quickly. But when you dig really deep, sometimes the stories and how they impact individual communities might be a little different.
And you think about the speed at which so much of this stuff is coming in. And I always tell people, as a journalist, I always felt that my main goal was to keep someone from saying, how come no one? Right? But how do you get people who feel like, even if they watch mainstream news, I've had a lot of this and it's so overwhelming, I need to turn away.
Yeah. I really love what you just said. You don't want to be, how did I not know? How? And I think the challenge is sometimes it feels like people don't want to know. Sometimes it feels like people want to have an uninformed opinion. And so when you bring facts that don't maybe align with that, or maybe they do, but they think, I don't need this, I already know. I think some of the most powerful journalism is when people think, oh, I never thought about that way before. So I think what I tell people that say I just have to tune out, I ask them, like, how do you know what you know? Really, I want to know, how do you know what you know? And what decisions are you making based on that? And people might think, like, I go about my life and I buy the groceries I buy and I fill up my gas and I send my kid to school and have my job and I don't need any of that. Until they do.
So they do.
Right? Until they think, like, well, you didn't vote for a school board member. And so now they're making decisions about, are they going to close a school or are they going to fund it in a different way? So, like, you didn't vote because you didn't know how important it was because you didn't listen. And so my as a business of King 5, I would love to say, like, watch all the news, read all the news, watch our 24/7 stream. But realistically, I think it makes sense to spend some time informing yourself. And maybe that time might have to be different for you. Maybe it is sitting down and watching a particular time. Maybe it's looking at the front page. Maybe it's listening to the morning podcast. I think you have to set aside a particular time to inform yourself about what's happening in your community, and then maybe set it aside, because I do think it can get, if you're reading and watching so much, it can get overwhelming. But I don't think the answer to that is to completely turn it off. I think the answer is, what is a reasonable consumption? Back in the day, you used to get the morning newspaper and you read the morning newspaper. And then you didn't read the newspaper all day, probably. You didn't keep reading it. You put the newspaper down and you went and did your job. And I think there's some value in that, as old-fashioned as that sounds. I think there's value of setting aside time to self-educate ourselves about what's happening in our communities, and then taking that information with us through the day and saying, like, did you know? And then when they say, where'd you hear that? You could say, I read it on King 5. I read it in the Seattle Times. I talked to my neighbor who was at the school board meeting last night, because I think the idea of just like kind of putting your hands over your ears, la, 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 la. Some might argue that is kind of how we got into some of the places we are, because we have people who aren't informed. And you know what? I will also say, some of this is on us as journalists. Some of this is us on media companies. I'm not sure we've always done the right job of serving the community and giving them the information they needed. Sometimes it's easier to give people information that they want, but that doesn't always mean it's information they need. And I acknowledge that I think we've been a part of some of the problems in the past.
Yeah, and that's something that I really wrestled with a lot, because I've always said that, news is what happens, right? And then, the old definition was news is that which disrupts the status quo. Dog bites man is not news. Man bites dog is news, right? And yet, I always tell people one of the reasons why I love to watch, I'm not a huge soccer fan, but one of the reasons why I love to watch the World Cup and I love to watch the Olympics is that I can tune in and see a story about someone from Afghanistan or Cameroon or Nigeria or Yemen. It's not some sort of catastrophe. And I wonder, from a journalism standpoint, how broad and how encompassing have we been in painting the human fabric through everyone? And when we report the news, when we talk about what's going on in Sierra Leone, do we talk about the human fabric? I was hearing about dogs being left behind in Ukraine during the war, and all the coverage. I never heard that being talked about in any other war. Just that human factor. And how do we, because I'm like, what's a journal? Always a journal, right? How does journalism make people understand that, yes, we do see the human fabric in everyone, and our reporting will reflect that at some point?
I think it goes back to how do we do what we do better? And I think that's something, again, talking about how has journalism changed over the last 5 years, there's been some real important, hard work done looking at ourselves, saying, anytime you look at a systematic problem, I think you have to first ask, how are we a part of the problem before you can fix it? And I do think taking a really hard look at how have we covered crime in certain areas, how have we talked about international news, how have we, covered politics, and sometimes, have we chased the squirrel instead of really digging deep on the important issues? And we've done a lot of that work and thought, how do we do better? And I think the answer is this. Our goal here is to cover news with context and empathy, center the voices of those impacted. It's not always easy, otherwise everybody would do it. But I think I see us working on that harder and harder every day. I think we have to. And so it's oftentimes the context. I go back to what you said is, what is news? The problem with the idea of it's what's out of the ordinary. Sometimes the systems that make things ordinary have to be news, right? And so I push back on there's shootings in that neighborhood all the time, and so it's not news. I think that's news there because there's questions for us to ask. What are the systems in place that are happening that allow this to happen? What are civic systems? What are population systems? What are policing systems? What are schooling systems? And so some of what we want to do is maybe dig into those things you think we are so numb to, we don't think they're news anymore. But in reality, sometimes I think understanding the communities around us is also news. And so I think that's important too. And also that sometimes the unusual isn't newsworthy. And how do we choose not to cover that, which we will often do at King, I will say. just because a headline is quote unquote kind of sexy, I am always challenging the room. How is this newsworthy? How is this newsworthy? Does it give people information that matters to their lives, that helps them be better informed, that explains something that needs to be explained? And just because it's wacky news, like, whoa, look at this, quote unquote, dumb burglar who's hanging by his ankle. Isn't this funny? Like, that's not news for us. There's no newsworthiness to that. And I think those are hard questions. So sometimes we will say we're not going to cover, in your words, the man bites dog, because was that person mentally ill? And that's not news if that happened necessarily. And so I think we're really asking harder, deeper questions about that. And so I hope that the people who hear this see some of that reflected. What's hard is that, at King, we do 12 and a half hours of news. We do a lot of news. And so someone might say, well, I didn't see that. And you might not have seen it because people aren't watching all that time. And so I think that rather than kind of say watch one time and think I didn't see that, that's not for me, I think really thinking about how do you get the source of information on the stories that do matter to you in your community, about your school, about your taxes. I will just really quickly talk about politics since we're in the legislative session. There's a lot of stuff going on that is going to have very important impacts on everybody listening to this. But legislative news can feel kind of boring for people. So that's our challenge for us as journalists, right? That's my job. And it's hard. This is really important. But how do we make people care about it when there are, they want it in 30 seconds. They want it in a TikTok minute. And I get that. And so trying to serve both of those things might answer some of the critiques of journalism. I'm trying to help you understand a 25-page legislative bill that is really important to you in 90 seconds. And by the way, make it interesting enough to make you care about it, memorable enough for you to remember. And that's hard sometimes. And I think we have some people that do a really good job of that. But I think some of the critiques of local journalism and journalism in general is the effort to take really complicated, important issues and make you care about them in an attention span way, and sometimes not always hitting the mark.
Just a couple more questions for you. When I was a sports writer for the Boston Globe, I was coming back on a flight with two athletes that had just been drafted by the New England Patriots. And I didn't mention initially that I was a journalist. We were just talking, just having this great time talking. And so they asked me, what do you do for a living? I said, well, actually, I'm a sports writer and I work for the Globe. I'm going to see you guys at practice. And they both screamed out, oh, no. What's wrong? And so they said, well, you should have told us you were a sports writer. When coach drafted us, the first thing he said was, the media is your enemy. And I've always thought about that. I was like, well, first of all, the media is not your enemy, it's just not your friend. Mm. But how people perceive us going in the conversations that you have with people who know you are a journalist, what are those conversations like? Friends, family, people that you might meet in a diner that know that you do this work. What are those conversations like?
It's really interesting. I don't tell a lot of people at first. And, obviously my friends and family know. But, that line that you said, the media is your enemy, it really struck me because we heard that from, our president at the time 8 years ago. And it struck really hard with me. It really did. And I think it changed the way that people saw media. And I can't change that back. But I can address that and say, people have strong feelings. I will say that. Stronger feelings than they probably had in the past, So, and they don't hold back. So that's sometimes why I don't tell them, right? Because they do want to talk about it. It's really interesting to me. A lot of times they think there's this agenda, and they want to hear about the agenda. And is the agenda mine as the news director? And I often tell people, if you've ever spent time in a newsroom, we cannot decide what toppings to put on a pizza together as a team. There's no way that this diverse group of, people come together with some sort of agenda going in except with the goal of like telling the truth. We have these very clear guidelines. And so that's often what I hear people trying to like, what is it? Who tells you how to do the stories and who assigns the stories? I'm like, well, we do, we decide. And so there's often like this misunderstanding of the process, who owns you, and even how the business works. This is an advertisement-based business. That's it, right? We don't get any government money. We don't get, it is local businesses that we are putting on the air. And, when local businesses do well, we do well. We want them to go, buy cars and buy new roofs and buy tickets to shows, all of the things that we show, that's it. And so, there's no agenda there, except to just tell the truth and do good journalism. So that's one thing I think that comes up a lot. I do think people ask things like, why is it always bad news? Why is it always bad news? And I think what I try to do is change the conversation about like safety is an important topic. For me as a mom, the safety of my kid, of my home, of my business here is one of the most important things that we can talk about. So when we cover it, how do you do it in a public safety perspective? I still I go back to that question. I like to ask people, how do you know what you know? And sometimes it doesn't really strike except in really important times. So people, they're talking about it again. There's another wildfire in LA. A couple of weeks ago, we had a crew down there in LA and people were talking about it. And I said, well, how do you know that? How do you know that? How do you know that the mayor and the fire chief are battling over money? How do you know what you heard about that thing? How do you know that? And they will say, I watched it on TV. I was like, that's journalism. That's journalism. And by the way, you could have seen it somewhere else, but I will tell you, I saw a lot of fake videos going around. This is something I wish the people hearing this could see the images I have seen. It is getting so hard to tell the difference between a legitimate video, it's not even still, and an AI-generated video. Let alone, sometimes it's just real video, but it's wrong. Like that video is from 20 years ago. That wasn't from last week. Or that video was from, Chicago, not LA. That happens already. That's a problem. But also just the fake video. So another reason why, before you share a video, look at the source. I got a junk call the other day. It was a spam call. It looked super legit. I got a text, but I knew it wasn't a good text because when I looked up at the number, it was an international based number that didn't make sense, right? If this was come pick up your mail, it was the source of the spam call, not the call itself. The content looked legit. I should have clicked on that link if I only saw the text, but I looked at the source and the source told me, Julie, if you click on there's some sort of virus you're going to get. It was the source. So I just encourage people, look at the source. And if you don't know, quick Google will tell you probably if it's a legit news source. I think that's just really, really important. And so sometimes when I do tell I'm a journalist, they get a lot of this media literacy, which I do think is really important and why I really appreciate even taking the time to talk about this podcast. I think media literacy is really important. My 9-year-old daughter goes to public school. She came home the other day and was like, I know what fake news is. Do you know? And I was very interested. And I was and she was telling me they're learning about this in school, which is fantastic. I love that. And, she's telling me some clues to look for fake news. And I thought, I think that's seems silly to talk about as a skill. I think it's a really important skill for us to be teaching our kids, to be teaching ourselves. Why do you believe what you believe? How do you know what you know? And not to be afraid of those answers. I think too, I really want people to not be afraid to challenge their own assumptions, to just because you think you know the answer, you think you know a lot about sports, but you still read about sports all the time, right? You probably still learn new things. And so you might think I feel really strongly about this thing, but that shouldn't mean you stop learning about it because you might learn more and you might learn something that makes you change your mind. And I think instead of gathering facts that only support what we believe, let's gather all the facts and maybe we can have a better understanding of the things that are important to us and to our community.
Lastly, being on the board United Way, when you were asked what made you decide to come to the United Way's board?
For me, so much of my day is spent digging into the problems that face our county in King County. It is front lines of the things that we have real challenges in front of us. So being a part of an organization that is solution-oriented, it was kind of something I felt like I needed for my soul, and seeing good people doing hard work, I think is so good. Sometimes I see both in my work and in my personal life, problems seem so big that you just throw your arms up and walk away. I see that happen so much. Going back to it's too hard. I just won't listen. I just won't watch. And I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be the person who only shows problems. I want to show solutions. I want to be part of solutions. And that's what United Way does. And I think they do it in these really big and creative ways that are really inspiring. There's people on the board that are really smart people. There are people on staff that are really hardworking, that are make me feel really good about even our big problems. I feel like, man, if anybody can solve the problems, if anybody can really connect the right people to the right places to have us have a brighter future, this is the group that can do it. And I want to be a part of that group.
King 5, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
To stay up to date with the latest news and information, tune in to King 5 TV or log on to king5.com/news. To learn more about United Way's Board of Directors, log on to uwkc.org/about-us/leadership. And now here's a word from United Way Board Chair Steve Hooper, the President of Financial Services at Tip House.
Hi, my name is Steve Hooper, and I'm honored to be the chair of the board for United Way of King County. I give to United Way because I know the team works closely with all kinds of organizations throughout our community, throughout this region, that are working hand in hand with the communities to deliver the services that they need day in, day out to make ends meet. It's an honor to support all of their work. Please join me.
Looking for a volunteer opportunity? Consider Rainier Athletes, a long-term mentoring organization that works with students and their families from 4th grade through high school graduation and beyond. And don't let the name deceive you. No experience in sports is required for volunteering at Rainier Athletes, which draws mentees who are interested in sports, as well as the arts, activism, and the sciences. Volunteer mentors typically spend 1 hour per week meeting with students and communicating with students' parents, teachers, coaches, and others. Rainier Athletes asks mentors to commit at least 1 full school year to the program. For more information, log on to rainierathletes.org. At United Way of King County, we are working side by side with communities to build an equitable future for everyone. Hourglass United Way is a podcast that highlights how we and our partners spend time making a difference in our communities. Our work is made possible by the generous donations from people like you. Please send comments and suggestions about our podcast to hourglassunitedway@gmail.com. To learn more about our work or to support United Way, log on to uwkc.org. I'm your host, Joe Burris. Thanks for listening. Until next time.